Hey, let's talk about fantasy. Hi, I'm Colleen Delaney. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I talk about books and writing. If you'd like, hit the subscribe button and we can hang out. Today, I want to talk about the genre of fantasy. So this video is going to have two parts. The first part being the fantasy books I've read so far in 2022 and what I've ranked them. I'll give you like a little snippet review, not a full review. And then the second part is going to be all the fantasy books on my TBR for the rest of the year. From about 2001 until 2010, I read only fantasy. I didn't read anything else. So it has been a genre that I have gone through phases of loving and being totally immersed in to reading less frequently. Right now, I'm doing a pretty good job. I've read 59 books so far this year, and 11 of them have been fantasy or sci-fi. I didn't include any paranormal or fantasy romance in that because I do include those in like my romance number, but it was lower than I thought it would be. I always thought I read about like a third of the books I read were fantasy. So maybe the second half of the year will be a little bit more fantasy heavy. We'll see. But between all the genres that I read, which if you watch my channel, you know I read pretty across the board genres. I just don't read horror because I'm very afraid of things. I read the most fantasy and romance. So I wanted to let you know what I've thought of everything I've read so far this year. I have a new ranking system, which I've talked about in my last couple of videos, and it is as follows. Because I don't rank books 1 or 2 stars, I just don't finish them. So instead, I came up with this ranking system to use. The lowest is not for me. Those are books that I didn't like. If I were going to give them a star, it would be like 1 or 2. Next are books that are okay. These are books that like I understand why other people might like them. I didn't like them very much. I got through them though. Next is solid read. These are books that I just thought were good. They engaged me. I liked them. Next is great. These are like, you know, like the 4.5 star books. And lastly is put this directly in my veins, which those are books that like I can't stop thinking about, or immediate favorites, or books I know I'm going to reread. So let's start with the first fantasy book I read in 2022 in January, and that was Sister Song by Lucy Holland. This is like a historical fantasy that takes place in England post-fall of the Roman Empire. We follow 3 siblings who are the heirs to their father's kingdom. One is named Cain, and Cain is a trans character in this time period. And next we have Riva, who had had a really bad accident recently, and we follow kind of like her love story, but it's not very like flowers and roses type of love story. And the youngest sister, Sin, whose story starts very much as an observer, but she ended up being my favorite character in the entire book. I put this book in great. It was a wonderful fantasy read. If you like historical fantasy, I would really recommend it. Then I read Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. I know I was a little late to this because it had come out the year before, I think in the spring, and I found this book to be great. This is a mythology retelling of Ariadne, who is best known for helping Theseus slay the Minotaur by giving him like a magic spool of thread to get through the labyrinth. And then she becomes the wife of Dionysus. I really liked this. I did cry at the end. It was a very good one of those books where you like go on a journey with the main character and follow them for a long period of their life. If you like mythology retellings, I really recommend it. Next, I read A Song of Flight by Juliette Marillier, and sadly this book was okay because Juliette Marillier is my favorite author of all time. This is the 3rd book in the Warrior Bards trilogy, and sadly it felt like the weakest of the 3. I ranked it okay because obviously Juliette Marillier is for me, and I did appreciate the ending, like the very end of this book tying up this trilogy in which we follow a group of 3 people. 2 of them are adopted siblings, and then 1 is a friend, as they go through this training to become kind of like spies who infiltrate houses of wealth disguised as bards, and then can sort of like gather information. Obviously I'm going to read more Juliette Marillier. It's just this one wasn't one of her stronger ones. Next, I have one of my sci-fi books, that was Parable of the Sword by Octavia Butler. And I would put this at a solid read, which I think is kind of a strange way to rank this. But here's why. This book is very hard to read in so much that it describes so much violence and so much sexual violence throughout the entire story that it was very hard for me to enjoy. But I thought that Octavia Butler's ability to create this story, which is like a near future, it takes place in the 2020s, but she wrote it in the 90s, where like the United States has really fallen apart due to crime and climate change. While the story is very difficult to read, it was a really cool premise, and Octavia Butler wrote the story very well, and I really enjoyed her writing. It is the first book in a duology, but I just was like too uneasy the entire time reading it. It was very difficult for me to read, so I will not be continuing. But I rank it as a solid read because I did find the writing really engaging and the plotline really engaging. It was just difficult for me to read. Then I read The Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel, and I had a ARC of this from NetGalley, so I don't own it. It was on my Kindle, and this book was great. So this is another sci-fi. Those are the only two sci-fis I had this year so far. And this book is kind of difficult to explain. It takes place a little bit during the 1918 pandemic, a little bit during the 2020 pandemic, a little bit in the year 2200, and a little bit in the year 2400. It has a lot to do with like time travel, and I don't really want to give anything away, but the book was fantastic. If you like sci-fi, I would really recommend reading it. I flew through it. I was super engaged the entire time, and I am going to force my husband to read it. Next, I have The Cartographers by Peng Shepherd, and this book was okay. I understand why some people really like it, but for me, it just missed a lot of marks. This is a contemporary fantasy, and it is about a young woman who is not really a cartographer, even though that's what they call her. She's like a librarian who specializes in maps, and she finds this old junky map and can't figure out why it's so important. And 10 years earlier, it had cost her job and her relationship with her father. Her father is murdered, and she goes on this like adventure. We flash back to when she was a baby and her parents were in this group of friends they called the Cartographers, and we kind of follow this like fantasy mystery with them. I understand why people like this book. Being a librarian, there were just a lot of things that took me out of the story, which made it hard for me to enjoy. I did think the end was exciting, but I didn't necessarily like the final resolution of it. So, okay for me. Next, I have Electra by Jennifer Saint. So she wrote Ariadne, which I just talked about a couple minutes ago, and this was her next mythology retelling. This tells the story of the Trojan War from the point of view of no one who's there, which I really liked that a lot. We follow three narrators, Clytemnestra, Cassandra, and Electra. None of them are soldiers or warriors, and it's kind of like the Trojan War told from their point of view. Clytemnestra is the wife of Agamemnon. Electra is the daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. And Cassandra is one of the the princesses of Troy. She is one of my favorite characters in mythology because she's cursed by Apollo to be able to see the future and have no one believe her, which, what a curse. And I thought this book was great. I would put it slightly below Ariadne, only because Electra was actually my least favorite narrator. So when she started taking over the book, I didn't like it as much. I really liked Clytemnestra because you follow her for 10 years, just like sitting in her grief and her revenge. And I really liked that. And Cassandra, I just really love. I love any story so far. I mean, this is my second one. Mythology retelling told from her point of view because I think she's a fascinating character. So that was a great one. Then I read Kaikeyi by Vaishnavi Patel, and this book wasn't for me. I have a really good friend who read it, and she would put it more at solid read, but it just wasn't one of those books that clicked with me. This is a mythology retelling of the character of Kaikeyi, who is apparently, I've never read the Ramayana. I think I said it correctly, but I'm pretty sure she's the main villain in it. So it's one of those stories in which the villain becomes the main character. I thought the beginning of this book was so strong, and like it's told in parts. And part one was fantastic when she was kind of like a preteen and a teenager. But then after that, I felt that the pacing got really off, and I wasn't really interested in the characters anymore. It was hard for me to like form attachments to them. And so then I kind of just was, forcing myself to finish it because it's a book of the month book, and I make myself finish those if I can. You might like it, but it wasn't for me. The next book, I wasn't sure whether or not I was going to put it in here. And I actually think if I do put it in here, I've read 12, not 11 books out of 59 because I added this one late. But it's Blackbird House by Alice Hoffman. And this is more like a magical realism book, but like in a weird way that I feel like it could swing fantasy. So this is the story of a house. So we follow a house, like a piece of property, for 200 years. Sort of how like some books would follow like a family over generations. This is a particular piece of land, and several of the women who live there are like witches, but like Alice Hoffman witches who are like, Are they witches? Are they not witches? That's kind of how Alice Hoffman writes witches. This book was great, borderline put it in my veins. I did really enjoy it. It's very short, so I read it in one day. And the beauty of this book is every chapter is only about 20 pages long that you get with like this person or this family. And by the end of the 20 pages, your heart is breaking for these people. So Alice Hoffman's a genius when it comes to getting you to connect with your characters, with her characters. So if you're looking for a quick fantasy magical realism read, definitely pick up Blackbird House. Then I read Siren Queen by Niveau, and we have our first Put It in My Veins. I love Niveau. I think she's a phenomenal writer. I was trying to think of like the right word to describe the way she uses language. And I almost feel like luscious might be the right word, but like not in a necessarily sexy way. She just can use words to make you feel so many emotions and feel like you are so there with the characters. So Siren Queen tells the story of like early Hollywood. It's kind of like the mythology of Hollywood told from the point of view of a Chinese American actress. Luli Wei is this young girl who we meet at the beginning of the book who wants to be in Hollywood, and she starts with like bit parts, but then she signs a contract. And this stuff is so cool because it's like signing your soul away to the devil. And just the way Niveau weaves magic into the idea of like the beginning of Hollywood, which is also really cool because when you think about like the beginning of movies, it was magic because that hadn't been going on for a long time. So if you like fantasy that's like different than anything else you've ever read, definitely read Siren Queen. If you like mythology retellings, I'd say read Siren Queen because that's very much that vibe. Enjoy. I want to apologize about my lighting changing. There's like a storm rolling in right now, so the sky's doing crazy stuff out there. Next up, I read When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill, and this book was okay. So this is a historical fantasy that takes place in the 1950s, and we follow this teenager named Alex who has lived through the Great Dragoning of 1955, during which a bunch of women spontaneously turn into dragons and like abandon their families to go live as dragons. I thought this book was okay because I was really excited for it, and then it turned out to be very, very slow. I think around page 200, this book picked up and got kind of interesting, but that's really far into a 330-page book for you to wait for it to get interesting. It's also not like super fantasy or magical realism, so that kind of threw me for a loop because part of the story is that the whole world's pretending this didn't happen, which I don't know. I understand that it was supposed to be like an allegory for like the feminist movement in the 1950s, but it sort of just didn't work for me, if that makes sense. Beautiful cover though, am I right? And the last fantasy I've read so far this year, I'm currently reading one I'll talk about in a minute, was The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Okay, I finally read this book. I've been saying I was going to read this book since January. So I finally did read it, and not unexpectedly, I did cry for the last 70 pages of the book, and then for 30 minutes after I finished it, because it is very sad. I'll say this book is great. While Circe was a Put It in My Veins, immediately top 5 book I've ever read, I didn't connect as much with the characters as I did with Circe. It took me longer to get into it. It was very sad. It was sadder than Circe, but I like the story of Circe better, which doesn't surprise me. I prefer the Odyssey way over the Iliad. So I wasn't expecting to like Song of Achilles more than Circe. This book is still great. It's the love story of Achilles and Patroclus, which one of my best friends is a classics professor and is very much in team they were lovers, they were not cousins. So I believe what she says when it comes to classics, obviously. If you somehow love mythology retellings and haven't read this, I mean, pick it up, but I'm guessing you have. Now let's move on to my fantasy TBR for the rest of the year. I'm currently reading Dark Earth by Rebecca Scott, which I have an ARC for, but I know is out because I was at a bookstore a few days ago and saw it and thought, oh my gosh, I need to read that and review it very fast. I can't believe it came out already. And I'm liking it so far. I'm only probably like 40 pages in. It's always hard on my Kindle to tell how far into it I am. But so far we're following 2 young-ish sisters who live in Britain after the fall of the Roman Empire. I think it's around 500 AD. And their father has just died. So that's like happens literally in the first chapter. So I'm not giving you a spoiler. And they don't know where they're going to go. And you can tell there's like all these new laws and that there's something that's happened in the past with their family to do with the fire, meaning that they can't go see their extended family. I'm enjoying it so far. I would say it's not grabbing me like crazy in because I've been reading it for probably 3 nights and I've only read like 10 pages a night or so before I went to bed. It hasn't been something that's like kept me up, but I have high hopes because it is post-Roman England, which I love. So wish me luck. I hope I love it. The next fantasy I'm hoping to read before the year is out, and I know I will, is Small Angels by Lauren Owen. This is my book of the month pick for August. I haven't started reading it. I just put the bookmark in so that when I do start reading it, it's right there. It's technically Gothic fiction, but the description said it has to do with the supernatural and that it's really creepy. So I feel like I can put it in fantasy. I try not to read too much about my book of the month books because I like to be surprised. I know there's creepy woods. I know there's a wedding. I know there's queer relationships, and I know it's going to be Gothic. So I'm looking forward to it. I love the cover. I feel like this is going to really get me in the mood for fall also. Next, I've got The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, which I'm planning to read over Labor Day weekend because I think it'll be a fun Labor Day weekend read. Tons of people have told me to read this book. YouTube has told me to read this book. So has Instagram. I'm not on TikTok. But this is the story of a woman who makes a deal with a god or a devil to live forever, but no one remembers her. And I can't wait to read it. I hope it breaks my heart. Next, I have Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty. This is the second book in the Daevbad trilogy. The first one is The City of Brass, which I read last summer and really enjoyed. These are high fantasy books that take place in Egypt, the Middle East, and also like a parallel world in which jinn and other magical creatures live. The first one had a lot of political intrigue, so I'm hoping this one does too. And I'm looking forward to it. I really was hoping I'd get to this in July, but I just didn't. So I'll get to it before the end of the year. The next books that I'm going to talk about are books I either have on my Kindle, because I have ARCs of them, or they haven't come out yet, or they have been very recently recommended to me, so I just have them written down, but not in my possession yet, or I'll get them from the library. The first is Into the Riverlands by Nevo. As I said before, we're talking about Siren Queen. I really love Nevo. This is the third and I believe final book in the Singing Hills trilogy. The first two were The Empress of Salt and Fortune and When the Tigers Came Down the Mountain. And I really liked both of them, and I loved The Empress of Salt and Fortune. So I, of course, cannot wait to read this one. The main character is Chi, who's a non-binary monk, and they are traveling around kind of like a fantasy version of Imperial China, collecting stories, and it's wonderful. These books are very short also, and so I read both of these, I think in like an afternoon. Like I got it from the library. When I read Empress of Salt and Fortune, it was like a perfect September day. So I sat in my backyard in the corner and read it in like, I think like 2.5 hours. Maybe less, maybe like 2 hours or 1.5 hours. And then I did the same thing with When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, but it was cold out, so I did it inside. So I'm really excited to read this one. And my book club is starting up again. We've been taking some time off because our lives have been really busy. And that is going to be my first submission for when I get to pick the book. Next, I really want to read Spear by Nicola Griffith, which I don't know a ton about. And it's short, so I don't want to read too much about it. But it is during Arthurian legend, my favorite. And it's about like a group of wild women who I think live in the woods. That also sounds fantastic. So I will definitely grab that, either purchase or from the library, and hopefully burn through it because it's a quick read as well. Next, I really want to read books 3 through 5 of the Wayward Children series by Shauna Maguire. And they are Beneath the Sugar Sky, In an Absent Dream, and Come Tumbling Down, I think is the last one. And I've read the first two. I really liked them. I thought they were great fall reads. So I'm going to read these 3 in the fall, I hope. They're quick. Again, I have a lot of really quick fantasy books on this list because I feel like I'll be able to read a ton of them if I do it like that. Okay, next I have 2 ARCs that I have from Nat Galley that I need to read. And one is The House with the Golden Door by Elodie Harper. And I did realize that I accidentally requested this considering it's the second book in a series and I didn't read the first one. But I'm still going to try to read it and see if it makes sense. It's about a woman who used to be a courtesan in Pompeii. I assume the first book is about her getting out of being a courtesan in Pompeii, and now we'll like follow her adventures after she's left that life. She's now like a mistress of a man who lives in a house with a golden door. So it sounded interesting. I just didn't know it was a book 2, but I'm still going to read it and hopefully be able to follow along with it. And the other ARC I have that is fantasy is The Song That Moves the Sun by Anna Bright. And this is a YA fantasy, and I really don't read YA fantasy anymore because I had to read so much of it when I was a young adult librarian, and when I worked in a bookstore, I worked in the young adult fantasy section. That was like the section I was in charge of. So I read a ton then, and I kind of got burnt out on it. But this is a YA fantasy romance, and it has a lot to do with astrology, and I love astrology. So I feel like I might really like this one. Even though it is YA fantasy, I feel like there's still a good chance it could be a great read for me. Then I'd really like to read The Mermaid of Black Conch by Monique Roffrey, I think is her last name. I obviously don't have this book yet, but I know it's about a woman who's a mermaid and gets turned into a human, and she wants to get turned back into a mermaid, which sounds kind of like opposite Little Mermaid. Next is The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected on the Water. I think I got the title right, by Zen Cho. And this was recommended to me by one of my friends. It is about a nun who like joins a group of bandits, and that sounds fantastic. So that's all I know about it, but I feel like I have to read that. Last but not least is The Cloisters by Katie Hayes. And I don't know a lot about it. I know that it's dark academia, and I know that it has tarot cards in it. And I'm obsessed with tarot cards, so I have to read this. I'm in like tarot groups and stuff like that. So I will have to read this and then talk about it with my tarot card loving friends. And that is the end of my very long fantasy TBR for the rest of this year. I will probably not read all of these. I will be really happy if I can read like 75%. I will most likely read 50%, but hopefully I'll get to most of them. And along the way, I will let you know what I think. Are there any books on my TBR that you've already read and you love? If so, please let me know in the comments. And if you've made it this far, please give me a sparkle emoji. That's like my fantasy emoji. I feel like the one that's like 3 stars, because it feels very fantastical. As always, I hope you are in the middle of a good book, about to start reading a good book, or about to start writing a great book. See you soon.